rest for some time.
Super fresh. So.
Thank you.
The topic of my presentation is connected with the cultural aspects of sustainable development. And actually it's quite a new topic. When I started this research, it was quite recently, a month and a half ago. I spoke with some colleagues that work in the field of sustainable development about its cultural aspect, and many of them were surprised that such aspect exists. Because the concept of sustainable development was coined a bit more than 2 decades ago, but initially it concerned only environmental issues, how humans' activity influences environment. Then later also social and economic concerns were involved in this concept, but the cultural aspect began, let's say, from 2005 with a convention I will mention later on in the presentation. And initially, sustainability was defined in global and national terms and level mainly, while later it became to concentrate on the local environment, on the cities. And actually with this turn to the locality or the local term began also the greater focus on the cultural factor of sustainability, because it was also connected with the development of the communities and cities. I will not stress too much on the sustainable development definition. I will try firstly to define the main concepts. Because the sustainable development is the topic of the whole summer university here, and all of us have initial idea. I will just mention this, probably the most popular definition. It was given in the Brundtland's report, and it says that sustainable development is the ability to retain cultural identity and to allow change to be guided in ways that are consistent with the cultural values of all people. Sorry, I think... Oops.
Too many traveling university.
But the most important that is connected with sustainable development and also reflects the need for having in mind cultural aspect is that it requires that we see the world as a system, as an interconnected system that cannot be isolated into different domains. I will put more attention on the culture, on the definition of culture, because the concept is extremely complex, and to define its semantic field is so broad that it can very often lead to misunderstandings. It can be understood on the one hand very broadly, very globally, as all aspects of how people and communities live. And on the other hand, it can be understood in a more narrow way. Culture as the heritage, or culture as only the artistic activities of all kinds. Culture can be also seen as an analytical tool for understanding the past and also the present societies. And for example, working at a European scale, cultural context is an important way of understanding why a certain policy or a certain law, for example, concerning heritage, operates as they do in the different countries. How the different contexts influence the implementation of this policy or law. There is a good operational definition given to culture by UNESCO. You can read it. It was in 1995. So the culture, according to this definition, is the whole complex of distinctive spiritual, material, intellectual, and emotional features that characterize a society or a group. And it includes not only the arts and letters, but also modes of life, the fundamental rights of the human being, value systems, traditions, and beliefs. And I will allow to read only one more definition of culture. It's given by John Hawkes because it's author that has much to do with the cultural aspect of sustainable development, and because this definition gives deep understanding for this concept. He gave it in a book written in 2003, and it says, "Our culture embodies the sense we make out of our lives. It is built on the values we share and the ways we come to terms with our differences. It deals with what matters to people and communities, relationships, memories, experiences, identities, backgrounds, hopes and dreams in all their diversity. And most of all, our culture expresses our visions of the future, what it is we want to pass on the future generations. Our culture concerns our present with connects our present with our past and with the future we imagine. It is with culture that we make the connections, the networks of meanings and values, and of friendships and interests that holds together in time, in place, and in society. Our culture describes the ways we tell each other our stories, how we create our sense of ourselves, how we remember who we are, how we imagine who we want to become, how we relax, how we celebrate, how we argue, how we bring up our children, the spaces we make for ourselves. Our culture is the expression of our desires to be happy, our desires to belong, our desires to survive, and above all, our desires to create. What is cultural sustainability, or the sustainability of cultural practices? It is the ability to retain cultural identity and to allow change to be guided in ways that are consistent with the cultural values of people. This definition is given in the Sustainable Development by the Sustainable Development Research Institute in 1998. But so far we don't speak about the cultural aspect of sustainable development, although words culture and sustainability are involved. And now I will try to focus on the relationship between culture and sustainable development. As it was demonstrated by the failure of certain projects since the 70s, development is not synonymous with economic growth alone. It is a means to achieve a more satisfactory intellectual, emotional, moral, and spiritual existence. As such, development is inseparable from culture, and strengthening the contribution of culture to sustainable development is a goal that was launched with the connection of the World Decade for Cultural Development, announced by UNESCO. This decade was from 1988 to 1998. And if we consider the narrow definition of culture I introduced a few slides ago, there are different types of initiatives how arts can respond to ecological problems. For example, arts project demonstrating new approaches to social and environmental issues, or art councils following governmental initiatives on buildings and processes, or support for energy and management best practice in building-based arts organizations. Another way is championing best practice in constructing buildings and other forms of capital infrastructure, or discourse and cultural critique with artistic practice. But the significance of culture is much deeper. as it is in the cultural sphere where people's conceptions of nature and communication with their environment in the broadest sense are shaped. In other words, from anthropological point of view, culture represents the values and practices that underlie all forms of human behavior. That is why the relationship between culture and sustainable development is understood in a holistic way. This includes the relationship between artists and their organizations and ecological issues. For example, for those of you who live in Sofia, there was art installation a month ago or even more recently with ice cubes in the city garden of Sofia in front of the National Theatre, promoting the more careful use of water. So this is one initiative how art can help sustainable development cause, but it cannot be reduced to this, the cultural aspect. As it is stated in the report of UNESCO, which is called Culture in Sustainable Development, it is not only about using arts to raise concern on climate change or about building cultural venues that are efficient in the use of energy and natural resources. It is not only about income that cultural industries can bring to the economy. And it is not only about asking more to the cultural circles. These are very important questions that need to be addressed, but they do not articulate the core question. The core of the culture in sustainable development is mainly about including a cultural perspective in all public policies. They continue, it is about guaranteeing that any sustainable development process has a soul. It can be summarized that the cultural dimension of sustainable development means to mainstream the principles of cultural diversity or the intercultural dialogue or creativity in the policies for sustainable development. And that is why UNESCO addresses the challenges of sustainable development and peace through a dual approach towards culture. On one hand, it aims at developing the cultural sector per se, meaning heritage, creativity, cultural industries, crafts, cultural tourism, by responding to the needs for legislation, training in cultural administration, mediation, and management for cultural resources. And on the other hand, it aims at ensuring that culture is considered in all development policies, and particularly those related to education, science, communication, environment, and social cohesion. So sometimes culture is treated as a component of social sustainability and sometimes as a fourth pillar of sustainability, or as a cross-cutting concept influencing the other three pillars. Here I will present for you two models of understanding the connection between culture and sustainable development. The first one is called the four pillars of sustainability. And according to this approach, sustainability includes four dimensions. You can see them. These are cultural vitality, economic health, environmental responsibility, and social equity. Here, I don't know if it's visible, are the three...
At the end, the scheme of the sustainable development.
For the first time that it appears on
Yeah,
our
actually at the beginning, the sustainable development scheme was usually reduced only to these three circles: social, environmental, and economic dimension. And the new one that comes with the culture is this one. In this model, they present it as a basis, as really the foundation for all the others, because actually it's exactly in the cultural sphere where we shape attitudes towards everything, environment including, and ourselves also. While the economic, the environmental and social pillars have been well defined and documented in community sustainability planning, inclusion of the cultural pillar is a relatively new phenomenon in sustainable development, and it plays important role in defining our attitudes, as I said, values, behaviors, and so on. This four-pillar approach to sustainable development recognizes that a community's vitality and quality of life are closely related to the vitality and quality of its cultural engagement, expression, dialogue, and celebration. Now, more and more governments, business, and organizations are using the arts as a tool to foster social inclusion and cultural diversity, rural revitalization, public housing, health, ecological preservation, and generally sustainable development. So sustainable development involves increasingly cultural frameworks that operate at the same level as do the economic, the social, and the environmental models. This concept of sustainable development was developed in 2001 by John Hawkes, who I mentioned previously. He's a cultural analyst and one of Australia's leading commentators on cultural issues and policies. And he addressed the need for the cultural perspective in public planning and policy by proposing practical measures for integration. In order for public planning to be more effective, he argues that government must develop a framework that evaluates the cultural impacts of all the other three spheres: environmental, economic, and social. And the government has to try to implement these policies considering culture in the cities and communities. This model recognizes that the community's vitality is connected with the cultural engagement, and it tries to foster partnership, exchange, and respect between different between different cultures, and also between different parts of the managing bodies, like or social actors more generally, like government, businesses, art organizations, and others. And this model is gaining quite quickly currency in policy and planning initiatives, mainly in Canada, in New Zealand, in Australia, and in Europe. The second model I will present here is the four well-beings of community sustainability model. And in this model, the different forms of well-beings are interconnected again, but culture is not seen as a base for the rest of the three spheres. The overall well-being, which is placed at the center with the green, is enhanced when all the four areas are given equal weight, and when they are interdependent and are able to move efficiently. A policy would be able to move efficiently through the different spheres and to take them into consideration when being designed. This model was created in New Zealand. It was because the New Zealand's Ministry for Culture and Heritage decided to respond to a local governmental act in 2002, which stated that the local government is responsible for promoting the social, economic, environmental, and cultural well-being of communities in the present and in the future. And according to this New Zealand Ministry's definition, cultural well-being is the vitality that communities and individuals enjoy through participation in recreation, creative and cultural activities, and the freedom to retain, interpret, and express their arts, history, heritage, and traditions. Through this model, the ministry emphasized the necessity for councils to deal with all four types of well-being in order to achieve sustainable development. Similar to other models, this one sees the different forms of well-being as interconnected, but here the culture is not a cross-cutting and basic sphere. I will present very briefly the historical background on culture and development relation within the UN programs, because it was actually to a very great extent a UN initiative and responsibility the last years to introduce this cultural dimension. In 1982, the World Conference on Cultural Policies that took place in Mexico City stated that actually the main achievement of this conference with regard to this topic was that it broadened the notion of culture, and it declared that culture is the set of distinctive spiritual, material, intellectual and emotional features of society or a social group. And this way it included not only arts and literature, but also lifestyles and human rights, the fundamental rights of human beings, value systems, traditions and beliefs. Then the next shift was in 1988, when UNESCO, which is the United Nations agency with mandate for culture, launched the World Decade for Cultural Development, and it advocated the contribution of culture to national and international development policies. This decade led to the establishment of international standard-setting instruments and demonstration tools. In 1996 was issued the report of the United Nations, Our Creative Diversity, which was very important in setting new goals for international cooperation and bringing in culture from the margins. And it advanced the view that development embraces not only access to goods and services, but also the opportunities that are given to people to everywhere choose a full and satisfying, valuable and valued life. In 1998, the Intergovernmental Conference on Cultural Policies for Development created a new global cultural policy agenda for development, and it was established through international cooperation mechanisms as well as national policy initiatives, both of them in partnership with civil society. In 1999, UNESCO's conference Culture Counts, Financing, Resources and Economics of Culture in Sustainable Development, this is the title of the conference, acknowledged the cultural capital as being crucial to progress in achieving sustainable development and economic growth. And then in 2003, the Convention for Safeguarding and Intangible Cultural Heritage promoted international cooperation to safeguard intangible cultural heritage, constantly recreated by communities in response to their environment, recognized as a main source of cultural diversity and also as a guarantee of sustainable development. In 2004, this is the only document I mentioned here which is not connected with United Nations, but it's very important, that's why I included it in this list. In 2004, in response to the lack of cultural considerations in Agenda 21, an Agenda 21 for culture was created and approved in Barcelona. In this Agenda 21 for culture, it promotes the adoption of a series of principles and commitments to recommendations to strengthen the development of culture on an international scale from the local arena, considering it as a collective right to participation in life of societies. And then there is another very important convention in 2005. I will come back to it later, again very shortly. The Convention on the Protection and Promotion of Diversity of Cultural Expressions. It recognizes culture as a pillar of sustainable development. Its 13th article says so, and creates the legal framework and operational mechanisms to foster the emergence of dynamic cultural sectors in developing countries through international cooperation for development. It's very important because the convention, as you know, is a legally binding document, so it's the first legally binding document that stressed on the cultural aspect of sustainable development. In 2006, the culture and development thematic window of the Millennium Development Goals was developed, and it is a groundbreaking experimental investment in large-scale cultural and developmental projects, supporting country-based culture and development programs. More than $95 million were dedicated to these large-scale projects connected with culture and development. In 2010, for the first time, a resolution of the United Nations General Assembly on Cultures and Development emphasized the role of culture in sustainable development and in the achievement of national and international development goals, including the Millennium Development Goals. And very recently this year, it was in May, just a few weeks ago, the final decision of the World Congress, which was called Culture, Key for Sustainable Development, recommended that the post-2015 development agenda includes a specific goal on culture. This Congress were organized by UNESCO and China as the first international Congress specifically focusing on the linkages between culture and sustainable development. Now I will come back to the convention I mentioned, only to let you know these two articles that concern the cultural aspect of sustainable development. This is the second article that defined as one of the principles of sustainable development cultural diversity. And Article 13 that says that parties shall integrate culture in their development policies at all levels for the creation of conditions conducive to sustainable development, and within this framework foster aspects relating to the protection and promotion of diversity of cultural expressions. And now I'm approaching the end of this presentation. I just want to mention an example of unsustainable development, also a recent example. It was, I don't know if I have to mention the name of the investor. It's a publicly recognized woman, probably not, but some of you probably would recognize her. A particular investor decided to make green energy or green industry, and she planted a huge area in the Vidin region with elephant grass or Chinese grass, but with a genetically modified grass. So she tried to make in a way a sustainable development initiative and good practice, but actually poisoned the land, so it is not usable anymore for agriculture. And
destroy the soil.
yes, and also this plant, genetically modified plant, is a big enemy to the bees. So here we can see how actually the clash between two discourses, two different discourses towards sustainable development. On the one side is the development discourse, here the investor, and on the other side is the nature conservation discourse.
Sustainable. Right.
Yeah, sustainable discourse also. So the investor.
Sustainable culture, all the sustainable things, not only the nature, it's culture conservation, social conservation.
This is my example. That's where I'm going to reach. So the investor did not take into consideration the sustainable development on the cultural level, where our attitude towards environment and our values are shaped. And that is why she invested in what she thought to be a green economy or a green industry, without taking care of the results of her green project and on the local environment and the life of the people from the region. So the sustainable development concept is applied only superficially as economic development at its maximum, because this is also under question probably her economic gain, but for the region it is very suspicious. But it was the sustainable development concept was not deeply understood and integrated within the cultural values from this investor. And here I mentioned just a couple of questions connected with the cultural aspect of sustainable development that we might like to think about for the next 3 days when we try to explore this northwest Balkan region. The first one is what are the specificities of the regional development depending on the cultural characteristics of the place, and how governments mechanisms take these localities into account. The second one is how the new phenomena of connectivity and mobility that link different regions influence cultural sustainability of the region, and how the local cultures meet other cultures. For example, I think it is tomorrow when we will go in the house of Lilia, and she will show us her mastery. I spoke with her today, and she said that she had a couple of courses teaching wavery, how to say it, teaching students how to wave. And these students were from Japan, from the UK, from she said even from France or Germany. She was not sure which one of these two, but from many different towns. So you can speak with her or with other people. It would be probably interesting to, or at least for me, it's very interesting to see how these two different cultures met. For example, she mentioned that with one of the Japanese students, the Japanese student taught her how to create origami, while Julia showed her our Bulgarian craft. And also they exchanged different cultural practices, like the Japanese were dressed with kimonos, and she was dressed and showed them traditional Bulgarian costumes. And the last question is how local traditions discourse meet the discourses of modernity and technological innovation. Thank you.